Welcome to Deep Dives with ISPU, a podcast by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We're discussing the latest one-of-a-kind research and data about topics affecting American Muslim communities today, with scholars and industry leaders from across the nation. You can subscribe to Deep Dives with ISPU wherever podcasts are found. Today, we're excited to share a conversation with ISPU Scholar Dr. Sahar Aziz. Dr. Aziz is Professor of Law, Middle East Legal Scholar, and Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers University Law School, as well as founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. She's also the author of a new book entitled The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, out now from University of California Press. That's what she'll be discussing in this episode of Deep Dives with ISPU, alongside ISPU Director of Research Dalia Mogahed. Let's start the conversation.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be in conversation with my good friend, Sahar Aziz, to talk about her new book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. Welcome, Sahar. So good to have you.
Thank you, Dalia. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sahar, what I like to do before even jumping into the specifics of any book with any author that I interview is to talk to them a little bit about why they wrote this book. Writing a book is like giving birth. What brought you to this topic personally?
This topic is indeed very personal to me as a Muslim, and also to me as a scholar who focuses on the myriad ways in which national security laws and policies harm the civil rights of Muslims in the U.S. And what brought me to it was having to defend my community in the years immediately following 9/11, when we were under siege. I was a first-year law student at the University of Texas, and we had switched very rapidly from being this obscure, somewhat invisible minority that people thought were exotic or didn't even really know we existed in the United States to being on the news daily, portrayed as a threat to the country, and our religion portrayed as teaching us to be violent. So that resulted in numerous civil rights violations of the community that I was raised in Dallas. So that's one reason. The other reason, which is more of an academic reason, is it was the book I couldn't find. I followed Toni Morrison's advice because as I was lawyering in DC and engaging in civil rights advocacy, I couldn't find literature that would support what I was observing in my daily experiences and dealings with Muslim American communities. And as an academic, I couldn't find the book to cite. So I realized it's going to be on me to write it.
What do you mean by the racialization of Muslims? Does that mean Muslims are a race?
Race is a social construct, and it is effectively whatever a society decides it is. So what Black means in one society is different than what Black means in another. And it tends to be socially constructed to impute upon the group that's raced inferior characteristics that are biological-like characteristics. So in fact, it is not a real thing, but in practice, and in people's lived experiences, it has very real effects. So if you think of what we are accustomed to considering as race, Black, Hispanic or Latino, Asian, the stereotypes associated with that racial identity are often negative, such as Asians being disloyal or spies for foreign countries, Blacks being subject to criminality or violence in criminal justice contexts, Latinos presumed to be undocumented and attempting to steal jobs. Right? These are all negative, false stereotypes. So when you deal with Muslim identity, there are also stereotypes associated with it that effectively impute upon Muslims these inferior biological traits, as if by being Muslim, by practicing Islam, that you are inherently sympathetic to terrorism, if not a terrorist yourself, that you are inherently illiberal and anti-democratic and anti-American. So you're treated as if it's some form of biological or genetic deficiency in you, even though that identity is not based on your physical characteristics, which is the more traditional structure of racialization in the US, skin color, hair texture, facial features. But in the case of Muslims, it's their religious identity, regardless whether they're devout or whether they're non-practicing. The fact that they self-identify as Muslim means that, or the effect is that society and politicians presume all of these negative stereotypes or impute those negative stereotypes onto them. And that effectively is the racialization process. And there are very real harmful consequences to being racialized.
And your book discusses these at length. I wanted to jump into the idea of the 9/11 attacks being a significant turning point in the racialization process of Muslim identity. Do you agree with that, or do you have a different thought on the significance of these attacks?
In my book, I argue that the social construct of the racial Muslim predated 9/11. It started primarily after, well, we can go as far back as Orientalism in Europe, and that certainly feeds into the racialization of Muslims pre-9/11. But if you think of American Orientalism or in the pre-9/11 phase, that tends to be associated with American foreign policy and hegemony in the Middle East and North Africa, which are all Muslim majority countries. And as you look at the various international events in which the US was engaged, usually militarily, in a way that produced hardship for those in the region, the media would portray those people, the native people, in negative lights, as if they too were terrorists, as if they too were a threat to our security, even though oftentimes it was the US that was intervening in their affairs. So the major events I identify and unpack in the book include the creation of Israel in 1948, the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the 1973 Arab oil embargo on the US, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the 1990 Gulf War I, and the World Trade Center attacks of 1993, which are little known by those who are focused on the World Trade Center terrorist attack of 2001. So 2001 took a process or transformed a process that was gradual and somewhat dormant. It would ebb and flow. In other words, whenever there was a major event and you had this surge of negative media portrayals about Muslims, about Arabs, which were often conflated as one, which, as we know, is not true. There are large communities of Arab Christians and Jews who are also known as Mizrahi Jews or Sephardic Jews who came originally from Spain. And there's very diverse religious communities, and there's Zoroastrians and Baha'is. But Arabs were always conflated with Islam. So whenever there was a conflict in the region, the presumption was it was an Islamic problem, right? People didn't understand, nor did the media seem to understand the difference between Arab as a culture and Islam as a religious identity. So when 9/11 happened, that ebb and flow turned permanent. So what 9/11 did is it expanded Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism exponentially, and it entrenched it to make it permanent. So what we have now as a result of the last 20 years, unfortunately, is that anti-Muslim racism is a permanent fixture in American race politics.
It was also extremely helpful to me to read about your topology of the racial Muslim. It kind of put into words what I've always sort of observed but could never articulate. Can you explain a little bit about that and its relationship with Islamophobia?
Well, when you study what we call subordinated communities in critical race theory, when you study racism, part of the inquiry is those who are engaging in the racism, which tend to be the majority group, those with power as a collective. But you also study what we call the subordinated group, those who are oppressed, those who are suffer the consequences. And included in that is also the internalization of the racism that is imputed on them. Oftentimes, that relationship between the racist and the victim of racism is very complicated. And it tends to create different responses, what we call identity performance in the social psychology and in critical race theory literature. Oftentimes, you'll have two buckets that are commonly referred to as the good and the bad, right? The good Black, the bad Black, the good woman, the bad woman, the good Muslim, the bad Muslim. That tends to oversimplify the ways in which the subordinated group survives or reacts to their subordination. So when it comes to racial Muslims or Muslim identity, it's not simply the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, which Mahmoud Mamdani eloquently articulated in his book by the same name. I'm arguing it's more complicated than that. In other words, it's not a dichotomy, it's a hierarchy, which then helps understand two things. The first is, who is the priority target by the government? And second, how Muslims respond based on how the government selects its priority target. So when you have 5 to 6 million Muslims in America, the government doesn't have the resources, even if it had the political will, which some politicians do have that political will on the far right, to persecute all Muslims. So they have to prioritize. So what they do is they look at those who are both religious and politically dissident. If you are a religious Muslim in terms of how you practice, how you dress, how you live your life, and you're also a dissident, you disagree with American foreign policy, you're on usually the far left or farther left, and you believe that the United States is engaging in repressive practices against your community or against Muslim majority countries abroad, you tend to be targeted as the most dangerous. And therefore, you will be subject to immigration deportation, you will be subjected to denaturalization, FBI voluntary interviews, surveillance, and all forms of other national security practices. Below that, the person or the group of people who are still seen as dangerous, but not as dangerous, are religious Muslims who are either apolitical or mainstream in their politics. They accept the status quo politically, and they're not seeking any type of structural or radical change to the political system. But the fact that they're religious causes the government to question their loyalty. They're seen as potential recruits to terrorist groups abroad because the government myopically associates religiosity with terrorism. So that's what I call the religious racial Muslim. So you have the religious dissident racial Muslim, the religious racial Muslim, and then even less threatening to the government is the secular dissident racial Muslim. So this is a Muslim who may be Muslim by name but doesn't practice. Maybe they even self-identify as agnostic, but they retain their Muslim identity, but they're dissident. They're very critical of American foreign policy. And in the post 9/11 era, that tended to manifest itself in being opposed to the Gulf War, opposed to U.S. foreign policy, especially on the Arab-Israeli conflict, opposed to American support of dictators in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And those secular dissident racial Muslims are also active in their dissidence. And then finally, you have what I call the secular racial Muslim. And so this is the Muslim who, again, secular in lifestyle, non-practicing, still says they're a Muslim, and also politically mainstream or not political at all. And that really is the quintessential good Muslim, right, in American society. What often is referred to as the assimilated Muslim, which is be secular. In other words, you can be Muslim by name, but that's all we're going to tolerate. But you need to be as secularized as possible, and you need to not oppose any type of American policy, because that would mean that you are not grateful to be in this country. That would represent that you are not assimilating. and as a result, you will be punished directly or indirectly. And then finally, you have the former racial Muslim, which is the darling of the Islamophobia industry. And we see those people very intentionally propped up by Islamophobes. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is the most high profile, but there are many others. And these are people who have converted out of the faith, either to atheism or to Christianity or to some other religion. And not only that, but then they use their former Muslim identity as credentials to legitimize Islamophobia. They write books, they go on speeches, and they essentially validate all the Islamophobic stereotypes that, yes, Islam is misogynistic because I was oppressed, and Islam is barbaric and violent because this is what happened to me. And so they use their one experience, which sometimes isn't even true, but even if it is true, it's only 1 out of 1.8 billion people in the world, to validate these tropes. And so that's effectively the topology. And hopefully it helps to inform both how the government treats these communities within the communities differently, but also how we as a Muslim community may inadvertently be responding to these forms of oppression without making conscientious affirmative decisions to say, no, I've chosen to be secular, or I've chosen to be apolitical or mainstream, rather than I feel that if I don't do that, I won't be able to work. I will be harassed by the state. I will be, deported. Because if that's the case, then to me, that is quintessential oppression.
And actually, with the topology, I've been really fascinated by how religious Muslims who are not dissidents, who are very mainstream, pro-American foreign policy, pro-American alliances, can be the most toxic in terms of throwing other Muslims under the bus that are dissidents and are propped up as, well, here's the religious Muslim. They're not even former Muslim, but they're fine with everything that is happening. They're completely pro status quo. Have you found that to be the case?
Yes, the religious racial Muslim is an interesting category because it is used by particular groups, oftentimes what I'll call the moderate Christian right, that because they themselves identify as people of faith, and they tend to believe that their own religious freedom rights are being violated by the secular left, which to them is kind of their domestic enemy. They appreciate the value of being religious and they want to preserve that. However, it's conditional. You can be religious as long as it's very private, as long as you do not want your religious beliefs to impact public policy, to impact schools, such as having Eid as a celebrated holiday in the public school system, and that your religion in no way jeopardizes what we expect you to be, which is blindly obedient to our foreign policy. That is its own kind of quagmire that subgroup faces. And again, the question is, are they taking these positions thoughtfully and with purpose and intentionally after their own critical thinking, or are they doing it as a knee-jerk reaction and maybe even subconsciously to survive and to be able to not be attacked? But that same group is also still considered suspect. Their position is very precarious because they could suddenly go from being this kind of good religious Muslim to this threatening religious Muslim, because to be religious is really what, in many ways, to be religious is similar to having dark skin tone when you think of phenotypical racism. So if you think of colorism within the Black community, where being lighter skinned is considered to be not only more beautiful, right, according to white dominant beauty standards, but also less threatening. And so to be less religious as a Muslim is kind of the same thing. So the more religious you are, to kind of continue on this analogy, the darker you are, and thus the more threatening you are. These types of internal divisions are typical of subordinated communities. I'm hoping that my book will kind of bring to light more conversations about how subordinated communities, in this case Muslims, respond to oppression rather than just focusing on the groups that oppress us.
Yeah.
You absolutely should be combating that. But sometimes the most pernicious consequence is the way we internalize it and the way that we divide ourselves and fight among ourselves and not realize that we're being played by the system.
Yeah. And you mentioned race quite a bit. How do Black Muslims fit into the topology?
It's an excellent question. And it was one that I wrestled with quite a bit when I was writing the book, because African-American Muslims have a unique history when it comes to the relationship between race and religion that is distinct from what I call immigrant or children of immigrant Muslims. First and foremost, because African-American Muslims are ancestors of enslaved Africans. And the way in which they were forcibly and brutally brought to this country is very different than the voluntary nature in which the immigrants and children of immigrants came to this country. And also, they deal with the legacy of slavery that affects all African Americans, which has severe consequences in terms of socioeconomic factors, in terms of political factors. There are so many, mass incarceration, all of the repressive aspects, right, of anti-Black racism that the Black Lives Matter movement is bringing to light, that the civil rights movement of the 1960s brought to light, that the abolition movement, right, there's been many movements. They affect African-American Muslims as much as they affect African Americans who are not Muslim. Meanwhile, those realities do not affect immigrant and children of immigrant Muslims in the same way. And if they do, I argue that it's significantly to a lesser degree. So as a result, my concern was if I wrote a book that attempted to converge both distinct experiences and merge them into one, it would do injustice to the African-American Muslim experience and also to the immigrant Muslim experience. So this book, The Racial Muslim, is very much about what I call the post-1965 immigrants and their children. Because in 1965, that's when the US lifted the quotas, the nationality quotas for immigration, such that people from the Middle East and North Africa, people from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Indonesia, could now immigrate to the US, because before then, all Asians were excluded and people from those regions were classified as Asian under the law. And therefore, 70% of immigrants from 1924, which is when these national origin immigration quotas were imposed, until 1960, 70% of immigrants came from Northwest Europe. It was effectively a whitening and a Protestantizing of the population. I touch on the history of African-American Muslims, especially in the early 1900s, and the way in which the Nation of Islam was spied on, surveilled, securitized by the FBI. I also discuss, the examples of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and other African-American Muslims' experiences, because the conflation of domestic security threat with Islam started with African-American Muslims, particularly in the early 1900s. And then it kind of converged with European Orientalism to produce American Orientalism to eventually evolve into American Islamophobia. So they're certainly interconnected and there's overlaps, but I think that one must write a separate book, and books have been written by Edward Curtis IV, by Sylvia Chan Malik, by Saad Abdel Khabir. I mean, there are many brilliant scholars who focus on African-American Muslim experiences. And I think that it's important that we identify the commonalities, but at the same time don't erase the experiences of these two communities that within themselves are very rich and diverse.
Moving to the future, what do you think is the future of the racial Muslim, especially as we consider changing racial demographics in the United States?
This is an exciting time to be alive in the United States in terms of the seismic changes that are happening. And what we've witnessed over the last 20 years, it demonstrates just how seismic it is. And what I mean by changes, I mean destabilizing and polarizing changes, not simply because of 9/11 and the so-called global war on terror, but also the fact that the first African-American president was elected during our lifetime. A blatant and unashamed white nationalist was elected right after him during our lifetime. That on January 6, 2021, an unprecedented, historic, attempted insurgency by white far right-wing extremists who are Trump supporters occurred, where the U.S. Capitol was seized by them. These are all manifestations or effects of this seismic demographic change that is inevitably going to change the distribution of power in this country, or it's going to change the political system from a majoritarian political system to a minority rule system, which would completely obliterate kind of the fundamentals of American democracy and the fundamentals of the American electoral and political system, and hence why we're seeing the fight over voting rights. So Muslims are certainly part of that kind of broader shift in demographic and politics. So with Muslims, the other major change is what we call kind of the coming of age of now the second or third generation of those Muslims who immigrated after 1965. The question for them is, how are they going to be the same or different than their parents and their grandparents who especially during 9/11, but certainly before then, because of their new immigrant status, they had their heads down. They were focused on building a life for their family. They needed to get jobs. They needed to save up money. They needed to get their kids through college. They were at the very kind of basic beginning of their immigrant experience in the US. And they didn't have the luxury or the social networks or the financial wherewithal to be engaged in American politics, to influence politicians. Yes, they could vote if they were citizens, but they really just didn't have the luxury of time and resources to do more than that. And so oftentimes they would just kind of keep their head down, stay in their enclaves where it was relatively safe, and work and educate and raise their children. So now the question is, what about this new generation that was born after 9/11, whose parents were raised here? And what we're seeing, and we saw this over the last 20 years, especially starting around 2008, when Obama was elected, is we started to see this group, this youth, this Muslim youth bulge, work more and more with other youth of color, with African-American social justice advocates, with Latinx social justice advocates, with Asian, with immigrant rights. And that then was allowing them to see the common forces at play in society that was producing Islamophobia as well as other forms of racism. It also allowed them to create these social networks and to be more involved in civil society in ways where they could actually leverage the resources of civil society to defend Islamophobia through these cross-racial, cross-community coalitions. You also see a significant amount of interfaith work that's been going on since 9/11. So all of this is going to test, I think, the community's diversity, because we're already seeing divisions where people want to take more of a progressive, systemic racism approach, where others want to take a more interfaith, what we'll call religiosity approach, that may not necessarily coincide with the progressive agenda, especially when we're dealing with LGBTQ rights, for example, or women's rights, or other issues where the monotheistic faiths have a lot more in common, right, in terms of social issues. When your community, when individuals within your community can make individual choices about their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, their lifestyles, who they want to socialize with, and how they want to live, without worrying that they'll end up in jail, that they'll end up deported, that they'll end up being a victim of a hate crime, or that they'll end up having to represent the race, that just because they do one thing, everybody else now is maligned as that or elevated as that. Once you get to that point of individual treatment, I think that's a sign that that you are starting to experience true equality. The question is, will American society respond accordingly? For example, we just had an atrocious anti-Semitic criminal act in Colleyville, Texas, where a Pakistani national who's Muslim went and held hostage 4 people in a synagogue. All of the Muslim leaders and broad swaths of the Muslim community condemn it. It's absolutely unacceptable in the Islamic faith. He did it in the name of trying to free, someone that he believed was a political prisoner, a Muslim woman. So the question is, will American society see that and go, oh, see, Islam is a terroristic religion, Muslims are terrorism, and now this one individual who engaged in a criminal act, will his criminal act now be imputed on all Muslims? And if the answer is yes, then Islamophobia is thriving, right? That is quintessential racism, collective punishment for the misdeeds of one person who happens to share the identity of the group, rather than when thousands of people attempt to threaten the election of the next president by seizing the Capitol. Nobody wonders if we have a problem with white people being disloyal, being violent, being extremists. No, we look at them for who they are. These are individuals. They should be held accountable for their crimes. And what they did doesn't necessarily condemn the entire white race or all Christians. That's the privilege of being in the majority.
So many more important questions are tackled in this book. The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. Thank you so much, Sahar. It's been wonderful talking to you. It's been wonderful talking to you.
It's my honor.
It's been wonderful talking to you.
It's my honor.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Deep Dives with ISPU. If you're interested in purchasing Sahar's new book, you can find information on where to find it in the show notes. You can also learn more about the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding's research at ispu.org and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at the ISPU or on Instagram at @_ISPU. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more conversations like this, subscribe wherever podcasts are found and maybe leave us a review. Thank you.